Good morning, St. Francis, and good morning, people of God. It is Monday, the 23rd day of the month of September 2024, Monday of the 25th week of the year, the 25th week in Ordinary Time. It is the second day of autumn, and it is still warm here in Carolina and at the Franciscan School. We've just completed morning prayer. Again, everyone's going back to their classrooms. The courtyard is empty at the moment. But today we also honor the memory of one of the Capuchin Franciscan saints, Saint Pio of Pietrelcina. So Padre Pio, as sometimes he is known in common understanding of him. A very complicated man because again, so he is a Capuchin, which is one of the other branches of the Franciscan family of the First Order, and he again is reported to have had the stigmata, the wounds of Christ on his hands, his feet, and his side, the same way that Jesus did, or the same way St. Francis did. And it's always a question of whether or not this was real, because the branch of the Franciscans that I am were sent to investigate it, and they said it was not. And then, but everybody else said that it was. And so when you send the investigators to take a look at this, and then they say no, but then everybody else says yes, and it becomes yes, and then he becomes a saint. It kind of always causes a little bit of rift, between the communities again. Again, whatever happened, to him, he was a mystic, and people did look to him for counsel and support and things like that in their lives, and he was able to provide it in some ways. Because of the marks of the stigmata, however, he had an irascible personality, so he was not always very kind. And so, again, the help that he was able to offer was good, but in his interpersonal relationships, perhaps not so much. And so, whereas Francis was suffering from the stigmata, basically kept it hidden and still went on to do, marvelous things. So too did Padre Pio, but kind of in a way that also kind of turned people off, because again, his behavior wasn't always as generous, maybe, or as loving as it could be. But then again, he was suffering the pains of the cross. So can you blame him, for his attitude sometimes, or his behavior sometimes? So complexities upon complexities upon complexities. A recent addition to the church's calendar is his feast day today, and so we remember him. We remember all of those who wish to experience, the fullness of Christ's life in whichever way they experience it in their own lives, and that God continues to grant them such ability to be able to be Christ, to others in this world. In our readings today, we have left the letters of the Corinthians finally, after our long reading of the letters of the Corinthians and its marvelous insights and the many wonderful things that Paul says to it, as well as the other kinds of things that Paul says within it. We now move back to the Old Testament, to the book of Proverbs. Again, in case you've never ever read Proverbs before, Proverbs is basically a bunch of pithy maxims. It's basically a lot of little admonitions and statements about how to live one's life and how best to live one's life within the relationship that one has with God. It's not it's just a list of things. So it's not songs like the Psalms are, and it's not a narrative at all. And so it's not a prophetic book. It is a book of wisdom in many ways. And so, today, we learn about not hating our neighbor and not fighting with our neighbor, and how God basically does not deal well with the arrogant, but the humble God lifts up. Again, important things for us always to remember. But that part again where Proverbs talks about the arrogant, and God's difficulties with them, that is always the trip. That's where you get tripped up, is because it is our arrogance that causes us to lose sight of God's presence of God's will, and also perhaps to misinterpret it and to misalign it, and thereby causing a lot of unhappiness, in this world, because we are not listening to God's word and God's law the way that we should, and our arrogance gets in the way of that. And to be careful of that always, because the more that we act in arrogance, the more we fail, to recognize, where God is truly leading us and asking us to act and to be as people of God in this world. In Luke's gospel today, Jesus talks about us being light, to the world. Again, and if you light a lamp, you should not put it under a bushel, because then it cannot give light to the house. You should put it on a stand. And so this is where, Jesus basically says, because you are listening to what I have to say, and you are trying to put into practice what I have to say, be that light that illumines. Don't just keep it to yourself, which is an important thing to remember always with faith, is that it is not for something that's a personal endeavor. It's not something that we do on our own. What society and culture unfortunately has done is kind of dampened down the power of faith and turned it into sort of a personal pursuit and nothing more. And it did that, unfortunately, because sometimes, again, the misunderstandings of the arrogant and how faith can be misunderstood, it becomes a source of division and divisiveness. And so society can only respond to that by saying, now we're going to keep it private and we're not going to allow it, to be able to influence anything. But that's not its purpose, and that kind of deadens faith if it just becomes something that is that is useful only to our own pursuits or our own little hobbies and whatever happens to be. But Jesus then basically says, be careful about what you hear, because again, if you do not hear well, and if you do not hear rightly, you will not be able to put it into effect the way that it has to be, and you will lose what you have. But to hear right and to hear well and to put it into effect, the way that it's supposed to be, more will be given and more will be experienced. A very important lesson to learn. Faith is not something that is private and personal, but it is something, again, that has to be handled with great care so that it can produce the fruit that it's bound to produce. A blessed day, St. Francis and people of God. May the Lord give you his peace.